Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is How to Live Longer, Why Reading Takes the Cake. The benefits of reading books include a longer life in which to read them. A. Bavishi et al. Expectancy. Noun. The state of thinking or hoping that something, especially something good, will happen. For example, they waited with an air of expectancy. Life expectancy. Noun. The average period that a person may expect to live. Hi everybody. And I just wanted to make with those two quotation definitions of expectancy and life expectancy. It just amused me slightly when I thought about this, that expectancy is a positive, hope of something imminently good to come. Whereas when they talk about life expectancy, how long you can expect to live, it's in very neutral, dull terms. And that in turn led me to this, one of my favourite books, Catch-22. It was another quiet, hot and troubled day. The heat pressed heavily on the roof, stifling sound. Dunbar was lying motionless on his back again, with his eyes staring up at the ceiling like a doll's. He was working hard at increasing his lifespan. He did it by cultivating boredom. Dunbar was working so hard at increasing his lifespan that Yossarian thought he was dead. I just love Catch-22. I don't read a lot of modern fiction. I'm very old-fashioned in certain ways. So, for example, I think music died with Barry White, and likewise, I think good novels ended in the 1930s, probably with Thomas Mann. But I'll make an exception for Joseph Heller. Catch-22 is a brilliant novel. And this goes to the point about longevity and lifespan. And in the live stream for the foreseeable future with my friend Stuart, I'll be doing weekly or fortnightly discussions of Proust's In Search of Lost Time. And I wanted to link it to this idea because I found a load of scientific studies that argue that reading leads to longer life expectancy amongst old people. And then I thought about all the longevity, long life experts and gurus online, and it interested me that relatively few of them ever mention reading. So I was going to briefly discuss the self-help industry and longevity gurus and all the people who advise you on how to live longer. And then I was going to show you some scientific evidence about the positive cognitive and longevity effects of reading. And then I was going to tie it all up by looking at the very famous Madeleine episode of In Search of Lost Time in the very first section of the book called Combray, where the narrator, or the character of Marcel, and I'll get into that at a future date, the complexity of Proust's narrative and who's narrating at any one given point. But Marcel eats this, and it's very controversial. Is it a cake? Is it a biscuit? And he has these memories come flooding back. So that, I think, segues very nicely into the whole concept of why Proust is so valuable, why he's so good, and actually how his writing illustrates and mirrors some of the findings of cognitive science. And I'll be arguing, as I always do through this channel, that good literature and good art is worthwhile in and of itself. But guess what? For everyone saying that you need to go on, 20-mile hikes every other day and eat, I don't know, boiled beetroot. I'm just trying to think of the opposite of my diet and what you need to do to lead a long life. But you have all these quite onerous life biohacks that people recommend. And they do talk about emotional well-being and how important that is. But then they very rarely, if ever, discuss how reading contributes to emotional stability and good mental health. So this is just one of... I've included a number of scientific papers in the descriptions box because what a surprise, quelle surprise, I am not a scientist. So rather than be accused of misrepresenting and taking some of the quotations out of context, I've included in the descriptions box the full links to these scientific articles. So anyone who's scientifically minded or just doesn't believe a word I say, then I encourage you to check out the full articles just to reassure yourself I'm not misrepresenting anything. So this is one of the findings of this particular paper. A 20% reduction in mortality was observed for those who read books compared to those who did not read books. This is amongst a large sample of relatively old people. Further, our analyses demonstrated that any level of book reading gave a significantly stronger survival advantage than reading periodicals, in other words, magazines or newspapers. This is a novel finding. See what they did there? Who says scientists don't have a really, droll sense of humour? This is a novel finding, as previous studies did not compare types of reading material. It indicates that book reading, rather than reading in general, is driving a survival advantage. So these are the famous, I'll explore why that might be, and this is one of the examples. I mentioned the Madeleine episode in Search of Lost Time. It's very famous, and for a lot of people it will be all that they know of Proust, which is a real shame. And part of me feels a bit of a sellout for just using it as the focus of this talk, because it's in some ways the easy option. But I just wanted to use it as a hook to explore some ideas, and then at the very end of this talk I'll read out the whole section regarding the Madeleine, and I will intersperse it with some paintings of a contemporary painter. That is, I'm not even claiming this painter's particularly good, but he was painting at the time of Proust, the Belle Epoque in Paris, and I think they're just quite atmospheric, and they're very fitting. They accompany Proust's writing quite well. So in terms of longevity and living a long life, on the left here, I've seen this Peter Attia quite a lot online. And just to repeat, as well as not being a scientist, I don't read self-help books, and I don't, never really pursued the idea of longevity by looking after myself. As whenever I come on screen, you'll be able to see for yourself. But so I hope I'm not taking a bad example, but this Peter Attia, when I've been looking for various types of beer online on YouTube, I often see some of his health videos. I think the algorithm's trying to tell me something, and so he seems quite popular. This book, Outlived: The Science of and Art of Longevity, was on the New York bestsellers list for a couple of years. So I don't think I'm taking a random example. I think it's a good representative of its area. And then on his show, he interviewed this guy, Michael Easter, who wrote this book, The Comfort Crisis. I love the subtitle, Embrace Discomfort to Reclaim Your Wild, Happy, Healthy Self. Well, by tuning into this channel, I think you've already embraced discomfort, so well done, you lot. And it does strike me as slightly ironic that someone writing in the form of a self-help book is saying that society is resides too much within its own comfort zone, because I'd take his argument quite seriously and suggest that in order to embrace discomfort in the sense of reading, you need to read more difficult things, definitely not self-help books, and Proust and others are a much better use of your time, dare I say it, than reading Michael Easter. So having offended all Michael Easter fans, I'll quickly move on. But here he is talking on this show with Dr. Attia, and I do find it that there is I think it's called, you'd call it a performative contradiction or a performative irony, that the very person suggesting there's a comfort crisis, arguably, to play devil's advocate, doesn't advocate more difficult, discomforting reading material. And this is part of the theme of this talk, that in all these discussions about longevity, good mental health, emotional stability, all these things, reading plays very little part, if any. And just so that's not a groundless claim, this is the content page for the book Outlive, the cover of which I've just shown you. And you can see nothing to do, as far as I can make out, with reading. And I did do quite a thorough search of the website of Atia, and I couldn't find much, if anything. Apologies if I've missed anything, but I couldn't find anything on the importance of reading. When you think, again, just repeat, I'm not a scientist, but a 20%, and check out the context of the 20% claim, please, in the full article. But the idea that there could be a 20% uplift in survival rates amongst old people who read compared to those who don't, I would have thought was a major, 20% is significant. And yet, in longevity discussions, it doesn't get a lot of attention. So this is another, oh, sorry, it's the same article from the Social Science Medicine Journal. So Bavishi et al. Claim reading books tends to involve two cognitive processes that could create, so they're trying to explain where does this, they call it a survival advantage, just better survival rates. First, it promotes deep reading, which is a slow, immersive process. This cognitive engagement occurs as the reader draws connections to other parts of the material, finds applications to the outside world, and asks questions about the content presented. Cognitive engagement may explain why vocabulary, reasoning, concentration, and critical thinking skills are improved by exposure to books. So I don't think there's any deep surprise there to parallel the deep reading. I'm just trying to pick out, it's a slow, immersive process. And there's one thing I'd highlight in the sense that you could argue maybe a lot of online consumption is immersive. You sometimes forget where you are when you get so absorbed by it. But it's definitely not slow. People tend to not even browse, but you flip from one thing to the next. And where it says the reader draws connections to other parts of the material, well, this increasingly tends to be done for us by the algorithm. So you're not doing that for yourself. But secondly, books can promote empathy. It's failed for me. Social perception and emotional intelligence, again, a bit dubious with respect to me, which are cognitive processes that can lead to greater survival. Better health behaviours and reduced stress may explain this. And I think I mentioned in the previous video, I was reading it's a bit involved, but it was an article by Richard Rorty that was critiquing Daniel Dennett's work, and it was very difficult, and I got completely lost in it. So that goes to the deep reading. And I've never taken hard drugs. I think I was given a Valium once in hospital, and it had obviously a calming effect. And that's the best description. When I was reading this Richard Rorty article, it was like, for me, taking a Valium. So I would completely condone this claim that reduced stress. For some people, reading Richard Rorty would give them high blood pressure. So you have to choose your poison. But I would suggest that there is this deeply immersive. It takes you out of you lose track of where you are sometimes. And as we'll explore as we go along, there's an argument that it is a deep meditative practice. But whereas, and again, I'm ignorant about meditation, my understanding of meditation is you're trying to empty out your brain. Ironically, I think the deep immersive reading of difficult, embrace your discomfort, according to Michael Easter, that type of difficult reading, it's a meditative effect you achieve while simultaneously giving yourself a good cognitive workout. So in physical terms, maybe it's the mental equivalent of the endorphins you get when you've been to the gym, which again, I'm not an expert in. But this is, the study was called Short and Long-Term Effects of a Novel on Connectivity in the Brain by a Gregory S. Burns, B-E-R-N-S, et al. And it was in the journal Brain Connectivity from 2013. And what they did was, they didn't choose, one of the world's best novels, unlike the Proust we're going to look at. But Robert Harris is an historical novelist, and he wrote this novel, Pompeii, a novel, so it's based on historical fact, which for some reason is one of the reasons they chose it as the test study. And they did this the wash in and wash out is basically the preparation and then debriefing, the after phase. So the people involved in the study read the actual book for 9 days, and they did a load of brain scans. So you can see the way the story progresses and the peaks, the mean arousal rating. So forgive the technical jargon, I'll try and decode it as we go along. One possibility for increases in somatosensory cortex connectivity, it's a mouthful, is that reading a novel invokes neural activity that is associated with bodily sensations. This is called the theory of embodied semantics. Somatosensory cortex activation has been previously demonstrated by the reading of metaphors, especially if they are tactile metaphors. It is plausible that the act of reading a novel places the reader in the body of the protagonist, which may alter somatosensory and motor cortex connectivity. So this notion of embodied semantics, I'd ask you to remember, because it's crucial, and the way in which the authors here pick out the reading of metaphors. And as recently I've been doing a lot of research on philosophy of mind, and a large component of that is the related field of cognitive linguistics. And in cognitive linguistics, which basically traces the role of language in cognition, as the title suggests, but it also increasingly in recent years there have been detailed neurological studies to try and track the links between brain development and language. And what they found is all various theorists are promoting the argument that the way we think at its deepest level, right down to its roots, cognition is heavily influenced by metaphors and analogies. And I plan to do a whole load of videos on this in future. But this idea of embodied semantics, I think that's interesting, because if human language is profoundly embedded in our bodies and our bodily experience, in an online world that is increasingly based upon non-bodily experience and the abstraction from your actual environment, I would claim that that has some quite powerful effects on all the reasons why, as I always mention, again, apologies for the repetition, but the high levels of mental illness, high levels of social anxiety, adolescent mental poor health, all of these things, I will eventually try to argue in future weeks, is to some extent, I think, can be linked to this notion of embodied semantics, or the way in which increasingly our society is moving towards disembodied semantics. And I'll be using, I said, the madeleine example in Proust, this idea of this biscuit cake soaked in tea is obviously a somatic, it's an embodied, it's a bodily taste thing. But all the way through the book, rereading it recently, it really struck me how many physical descriptions there are. So in the very first section of the novel, he's describing his auntie's house, or his grandmother's house. He's staying at his grandmother's house in Combray, and he describes the I think there's a currant bush coming through the window. So even when he's talking about the room of a house, there's all these very vivid smells, and the fact that the outside garden is coming in. He describes the inside of a church later on. A lot of descriptions are about the physicality of stone in terms of architecture, or flowers, or grass. And that really struck me. And again, in an increasingly online world, when people are spending more and more time online, this is something, it was just something that made me think about. It's an element perhaps that isn't commented upon enough regarding Proust. But this is just a visual demonstration of various networks they traced. So there's, in the article you can check out for yourself, there are separate various scans they show. but you can just get some idea. They're tracing the linkages across the hemispheres of the brain, and you can see how that maps below to the telling of the story. So this is again from the study. It is interesting to note, however, that the regions previously called the protagonist network, the dorsomedial PFC and right TPJ, constitute a very different network than the somatosensory regions, excuse me, and bear more similarity to the networks we identified as having short-term changes. It's possible that both the cerebellar changes and the somatosensory changes reflect changes in motor control related to the act of reading. Such processes might relate to oculomotor coordination and attention, for example, and have nothing to do with the content of the novel. So they make various interpretations of their own data, and it's just an interesting one that we always think it's the profound content of novels, but maybe they're suggesting it's also just to do with the concentration and coordination required to read something slightly complicated. And I think I mentioned earlier, when I look at Proust in more detail, the subtle ways in which he changes the form of narrative, who's narrating, from what perspective, there are very subtle changes, and they're the type of thing, if your brain's trying to trace that, it's less perhaps about the actual content of what you're reading about than the various forms in which the narrative takes. But again, this is from the conclusion of this study. In summary, we have demonstrated that across the likely array of diverse experiences encountered by our participants, there was a detectable and significant common alteration of their RSN, I think that's resting state networks, which I'll explain in a second, associated with reading sections of a novel the previous evening. Moreover, these changes could be segregated into networks associated with short-term changes originating near the left angular gyrus and long-term changes dispersed bilaterally in somatosensory cortex. So, in case you were wondering, that's what happens. It remains an open question for further study as to how lasting these effects are, but our results suggest a potential mechanism by which reading stories not only strengthen language processing regions, but also affect the individual through embodied semantics in sensory motor regions. So we're back to this idea of embodied semantics. So it's not just a semantic argument to argue that reading is important. This idea, the link with physical health, or at least brain health, I'm arguing there's more and more evidence as demonstrated in reports like this. So this is looking at, I think this scan relates to shortly after. They're trying to see what long-term effects. So shortly after having read the story, they noticed still this notion of resting state networks. What does the brain look like? And I think I'm not misrepresenting, but in the study they're suggesting that your resting state network is more active even after you've finished reading the books. This idea that I've made the claim in the past on the channel that good literature changes you as a person, whereas if you're reading something lowbrow, you may be temporarily entertained, but it doesn't actually change you. And that was just my commonsensical interpretation of years of reading and why I think it's valuable. And it's a very humanistic interpretation, but it's interesting when you look at the science, there does seem to be some support for this view. And these are, I mentioned this idea of embodied cognition. This is the type of material I want to look at in future. So George Lakoff is quite a famous cognitive linguist, and he's done a lot of work with this guy Mark Johnson. And this notion of, just like the book cover, philosophy in the flesh is he basically goes throughout the history of philosophy and interestingly traces as the subtitle describes, the embodied mind and its challenge to Western thought. So part of the argument, and I've alluded to it when I've discussed Daniel Dennett and his ideas about consciousness, there's an argument that since the time of Plato and his concept of ideal forms, there's been a tendency in Western philosophy to be more and more abstract and to disassociate the mind from the body and to think in purely abstract terms. And cognitive linguistics is a very powerful corrective mechanism that constantly emphasizes the grounded, bodily based nature of language and how that informs how we think. So, as applies to Proust, because I'm just using Proust as an example, I've claimed that reading, or the scientific study suggests that reading novels has certain survival advantages. And then in the longevity, the Michael Easter idea, embrace your discomfort. Well, like I said, I'm taking that seriously. Let's try reading something difficult, complex, highly nuanced, and bloody long. And let's see what the effect might be. So this is a very specific article, as you can see. So Emily Troscianko, I don't know what language the surname is from. So Troscianko or Shianko. I'll say Troscianko, and apologies if that's wrong. Cognitive Realism and Memory in Proust's Madeleine episode. And there's a whole journal called Memory Studies. So she writes, memories cued by olfactory sensations seem privileged in several ways. There is also evidence that the vividness and specificity, and by implication accuracy, of odour-cued memories may be exaggerated because of their emotional quality, which creates a greater sense of being brought back by the memories, leading them to be reported as more vivid and specific than they actually are. And I found this really interesting because Emily here is, I'll call her Emily, she doesn't know me from Adam. Dr. Troscianko is arguing, it seems, it's implicit. I just find this a fascinating insight into the difference between the humanities and the sciences. Even when they try and combine, some of the initial assumptions are quite radically different. So she's suggesting, at least in the Proust, she's talking about olfactory and smelling memories in general. But the whole article is based on Proust's episode of the Madeleines. And what's interesting is she's claiming that fewer people than you might expect have smell-based memory recall. So then she asked, why do people think it's more common than it is? And she gives this explanation. But implicit in her explanation is, and I'd be interested in what you think of my interpretation, but it seems that she has at the back of her mind an objective measurement of how accurate a memory is. And I think the whole point of Proust's book is, and to be fair to her, she does, as the article progresses, deal with some of the nuance. So, and I've included this article, again, in the descriptions box just to make sure I don't misrepresent her. But this idea, more vivid and specific than they actually are, well, who's judging how they actually are, if not the person recalling the memory? And the memory, by definition, is an incredibly subjective experience of your own personal past. So what I'm suggesting is she's claiming some type of scientific objectivity where I just don't think it's appropriate. And what she goes on to argue in the article is that Proust, a lot of the way he writes is actually, it was ahead of its time in terms of cognitive science. And she says, and the bits that aren't true to modern cognitive science are actually true to our common sense assumptions. So that's why she argues Proust is such a powerful writer. He's either scientifically spot on, or he's also spot on as you commonsensically understand human experience. But it's this division that she seems to be wanting to make. I don't really understand the value of explaining in purely technical terms how memories might be processed and how they might originate. I could see some scientific value to that, but not to judge the memories in terms of accuracy by scientific standards. To repeat, I just think it's a category error. Memory is inherently subjective. But anyway, just to develop this point and give you more evidence from what she says. Recent evidence suggests that, contrary to popular belief, involuntary memories are more likely to be triggered by abstract or verbal cues than by sensory or state, in other words, physiological or mood cues. So in a paper, Mace found that 68% of participants in voluntary memory experiences were triggered by verbal cues, with only 30% due to sensory cues and 2% to state cues. Of the sense-cued memories, only a small number, 3% of the total memories, so it's 3% of 30% if I've understood correctly, were induced by odours or flavours. Here too, the memory's emotional quality may be responsible for misconceptions. And this goes to the point I just made. It's the memory's emotional quality may be responsible for the misconception. I'm not sure how you can misconceive an emotion. You either feel the emotion or you don't. And if the emotion is true, it may not be factually correct. But if it's emotionally true, it's psychologically true. Otherwise, you're using object measurements of emotions, which strikes me just as a contradiction in terms. But anyway, I could witter on about that. I think I've made the point at least once. Mace suggests that this, and a stronger sense of being brought back, makes sense-cued involuntary memory experiences more salient and hence memorable than those triggered by abstract verbal cues, thus making them seem a more common occurrence than they really are. Sense-cued memories are also, Mace suggests, likely to be less congruent with current cognitive activity, again making them more salient and less likely to be confused with a voluntary memory, as may occur if the cue is a thought or the reading of a word. So I think what basically Mace and Troscianko are suggesting is that, ironically, because they're relatively rare, when you do have an involuntary memory that's prompted by a sensory cue, as in the Madeleines and Proust, it has more of a felt effect because it's less common. Cognition and consciousness consist of fundamentally multiple, parallel non-unified processes. And Daniel Dennett's, who I talked about in the previous video, metaphor of multiple drafts is in this sense more accurate than the folk psychological commonplace of a single stream of consciousness. And that's William James, I think, the American philosopher stroke psychologist. This notion of multiple drafts, it's complicated, so I'll only just skim over it. But Daniel Dennett has this notion that the human brain operates at various levels simultaneously, and we process an external reality not as a single unified ego, but as this amalgamation of parallel processes. Now, that goes against the common sense historical traditional notion, is that each individual has this inner voice in their head, an ego, and it's a stream of consciousness, and you're a unified individual as you experience the world. So in cognitive science terms, that's not realistic. Nonetheless, the habit of narrativizing, making retrospectively meaningful, linear and singular narratives out of one's own experiences, is ubiquitous, whether the narratives are unarticulated or made public. An important property of the life story, both linguistically and psychologically, is that it must be coherent. Sorry, there's a spelling error there. Is that it must be coherent. Its coherence is not a property of the life, but rather an achievement of the speaker in constructing the story. So that's interesting, because it's saying from a scientific point of view, our memories and our sense of self isn't how we turn it into a narrative. But simultaneously, there's seemingly a recognition from the scientists that what we do as humans is make narratives. So Daniel Dennett, in his paper, Narratives of a Centre of Gravity, I used in the previous video, he basically makes the blunt claim, no narrative, no self. So it's what is slightly controversial in Daniel, and I don't think Daniel Dennett's work needs to be so controversial. I think people get wound up by him too much. But his idea is that actually, in scientific terms, we are our cognitive processes are in complex flux and operating at many different levels simultaneously. But as individuals, we have an illusionary sense of a unified ego because we tell narratives. And just you could use the word illusion or another word and it makes it sound derogatory. But the fact that we have to tell narratives, just because that's not cognitively, scientifically, the way we receive information and process it, for all human intents and purposes, it's the only show in town, it's the only trick that we have, and it's an immensely human characteristic. And this goes back to it helps us create a sense of consistency. And if you think of consistency as contributing towards a sense of longevity across our lifespan, this is what Proust's incredibly complex novel is all about. This telling a narrative is what Proust's narrator does over a very long book that's incredibly nuanced and sophisticated and goes into lots of detail. But the reason why at the very beginning of this talk I contrasted the definition of expectancy with the notion of life expectancy is because the way in which we tell narratives, I would argue, has a direct effect on what we expect from life. If, like Dunbar, all you're doing is trying to maximize your life, which I think some of these longevity gurus are encouraging you to do, it's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory. You lie in bed looking at the ceiling like Dunbar, or you can engage in complex, enjoyable narratives and read Proust. Reading Proust will make you live longer than if you read nothing. I'm not sure how scientifically valid Dunbar's approach is. I think the joke that Heller's making is, even if Dunbar died earlier, in that sense, he wouldn't have lived longer, but his perceived passage of time would be longer because he's seeking boredom, and when you're bored, time passes more slowly. But if you don't want to go down Dunbar's route and you want to lead an interesting life and you want to engage with interesting narratives, then the alternative is to read complex narratives that reinforce this cognitive tendency of human beings to tell narratives about themselves and other people. And according to some of the research, you'll also live longer. Coherence is a property of memory. Coherence as a property of memory reports rather than of the memories themselves is a demand convergent with that of literary form. So it's backing up what I just said. The description of all this which is assuming form and substance, and we'll talk about that when we get to the actual description of the madeleine eating. The description of all of this which is assuming form and substance after eating the madeleine seems indeed better suited to the content of a self-narrative than the typical fragment of content associated with involuntary autobiographical memories. This observation reinforces the conclusion that in the memories elicited, as distinct from their cueing and retrieval, the relationship between narrative and psychological factors is especially complex. So this goes directly to what I was trying to make the claim for Proust. Why I think Proust is so important a writer is that in a very natural way, he's providing a narrative form to some of the very complex cognitive processes that scientists write about in relation to memory and life experience. In the narrative of remembered events, the narrative of remembered events taps into our expectations about what good narratives should do. But these in turn may well derive from our cognitive habits of narrativization. We might therefore conclude that the wealth of coherently linear, recalled events is cognitively unrealistic because it belies the multiple parallelisms of cognitive activity, but feels plausible because it corresponds to our folk psychological understanding of cognition, based on our habits of creating coherent cognitive narratives. So I find this vaguely amusing because it's scientists belatedly realizing that although science can explain in mechanical process-based terms how things work, someone like Proust, with his incredibly nuanced psychological insight and artistic ability, had a intuitive sense of how the human brain tells itself narratives. So Proust doesn't meet the scientific criteria for a complete cognitive accuracy, but actually Proust matches much more how it feels to remember as a human being. So to put all that's all very wordy. I'm now going to show you a series of paintings that will be used to be interspersed with the Madeleine episode from Proust. So that's how I'll finish this talk. I'll just read you the whole of the episode of the tasting of the Madeleine, and hopefully that will encourage you to check out the live stream, which will be online after it's been live, obviously. And hopefully you'll join the Proust book club. And just to repeat, I don't think that this was a great painter, but he was painting at the time, and he's quite poignant, some of his paintings, because if you look closely, you'll see evidence that sometimes they'll just be horse carriages, but depending on the time that he was painting, you just begin to get the sense of the world changing radically, and you see cars and omnibuses in the streets of Paris, and the old way, and it matches Proust's life. You know, Proust was like this bridge from the late 1800s, when there were still memories of the Napoleons, the various Napoleons, and the various French revolutions from 1789 and then in 1848, I think it was. So it's this passage of time that suddenly speeded up so much. And I think that's an element of the poignancy of Proust's novel. So very early on in the novel, I'm thinking there's a description of the young Marcel, and is he in Combray? But he's in the street, and some soldiers go by on horses galloping. And then later on, they would be obsolete, those soldiers. Tanks would arrive. Proust died in 1922, I think it was. So you've got the First World War and the arrival of mechanized warfare and tanks. So over his whole lifetime, this change, the nostalgia of his youth actually maps onto the passage of an old era and, never to be seen again. And sure, that era had its faults, but the pace of life, the lack of mechanization, in the countryside, at least for the middle class, this idyllic lifestyle they had, was to be no more. But anyway, just to start with, so there'll be paintings by this guy each time, and then a section of the Madeleine right up to the end of the talk. So this is called Saint Augustine Church Under the Snow. And this is the beginning of the Madeleine episode, Madeleine. I feel that there is much to be said for the Celtic belief that the souls of those whom we have lost are held captive in some inferior being, in an animal, in a plant, in some inanimate object, and so effectively lost to us until the day, which to many never comes, when we happen to pass by the tree or to obtain possession of the object which forms their prison. Then they start and tremble. They call us by our name, and as soon as we have recognized their voice, the spell is broken. We have delivered them. They have overcome death and returned to share our life. And so it is with our own past. It is a labour in vain to attempt to recapture it. All the efforts of our intellect must prove futile. And I've italicised and emboldened that because it reminded me, and apologies if it's a bit of a tangent, but it reminds me a bit of Plato. Because in Plato's works, especially, for example, the Republic, he does things like claim that in the ideal republic, no poets would be allowed. And I'd suggest that Plato is very often being ironic, because Plato presents his thoughts in the form of allegory. So I think it's book 7, the allegory of the cave, is within the Republic, and he presents his ideas in dramatic dialogue. So if Plato was against the poets, I think he's being quite hypocritical. And obviously to me, I think there's a level of irony that people often overlook in Plato. Likewise, Proust himself often suggests that his novel is all about this dichotomy or this contrast between voluntary and involuntary memory. And he's always opposing the two things. And here he says, and so it is with our own past. It is a labour in vain to attempt to recapture it. All the efforts of our intellect must prove futile. And yet, the whole 4,000 or whatever number of pages, depending on the edition you have, those thousands of pages are his intellect describing the cognitive effects of memory and the humanity of it. So he's belying his own claim here in the mode of writing it. So I'm suggesting that, like Plato, Proust had a sense of irony that's played out in his writing. The past is hidden somewhere outside the realm, beyond the reach of intellect. He's doing it again. In some material object, in the sensation which that material object will give us, which we do not suspect. And as for that object, it depends on chance whether we come upon it or not before we ourselves must die. Many years have elapsed during which nothing of Combray, save what was comprised in the theatre and the drama of my going to bed there, had any existence for me, when one day in winter, as I came home, my mother, seeing that I was cold, offered me some tea, a thing I did not ordinarily take. I declined at first, and then, for no particular reason, changed my mind. She sent out for one of those short, plump little cakes, or biscuits, called petite madeleine, which look as though they had been moulded in the fluted scallop of a pilgrim's shell. And soon, mechanically, weary after a dull day with the prospect of a depressing morrow, I raised to my lips a spoonful of the tea in which I had soaked a morsel of the cake. No sooner had the warm liquid and the crumbs with it touched my palate, a shudder ran through my whole body, and I stopped, intent upon the extraordinary changes that were taking place. An exquisite pleasure had invaded my senses, but individual, detached, with no suggestion of its origin. And at once the vicissitudes of life had become indifferent to me, its disasters innocuous, its brevity illusory. This new sensation having had on me the effect which love has of filling me with a precious essence, or rather this essence was not in me, it was myself. I had ceased now to feel mediocre, accidental, mortal. Whence could it have come to me, this all-powerful joy? I was conscious that it was connected with the taste of tea and cake, that it infinitely transcended those savours, could not, indeed, be of the same nature as theirs. And the bit I've italicised there and emboldened, this precious essence, it just reminded me slightly of Schopenhauer, who I've talked about in other videos, and his notion of the world as will and representation. Will for Schopenhauer is this life force, and representation is our aesthetic engagement. Or sorry, our aesthetic representation of that life force is contained within art. And for Schopenhauer, his aesthetic theory was that art provides a way of contemplating this ubiquitous life force that otherwise just overwhelms us and is everywhere, this dog eat dog world. And it offers temporary respite. And I think that's what reading Proust is like. I think it's the absolute encapsulation of Schopenhauer's aesthetic theory. But just to give you a practical example, this idea of the fluted scallop of a pilgrim's shell, the image of the Madeleine. This is at the entrance, the one on the left, the stone scallop is at the entrance of the cathedral in Toul, I think. And then you can see it's on the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. It's the scallop is used as on the road signs, and also the scallop. I think tradition was it was used as a serving bowl for the pilgrims, would be given food. It was like a measuring cup and basically a plate. And then there's the symbolism is the shell offers protection, and then there's the idea that all the paths lead to the center. So there's various layers of meaning, as most good symbols have. I drink a second mouthful, in which I find nothing more than in the first, a third, which gives me rather less than the second. It's time to stop. The potion is losing its magic. It is plain that the object of my quest, the truth, lies not in the cup, but in myself. The tea is called up in me, but does not itself understand, and can only repeat indefinitely with a gradual loss of strength the same testimony, which I too cannot interpret, though I hope at least to be able to call upon the tea for it again, and to find there presently, intact and at my disposal, for my final enlightenment. I put down my cup and examine my own mind. It is for it to discover the truth, but how? What an abyss of uncertainty whenever the mind feels that some part of it has strayed beyond its own borders, when it, the seeker, is at once the dark region through which it must go seeking, where all its equipment will avail it nothing. And I thought that italicized and emboldened section, that's me, not Proust, goes to this notion of trying to cognitively, using cognitive science, measure scientifically the process, where all its equipment will avail it nothing, I think is a good description of science's limitations in this field. So you can see the cathedral in the background, and the metro station is what I was saying earlier about the changing of the time. Apologies, that may not be the cathedral, I think. Is that the Bastille? I don't know. But it's an old building, as you can see. Seek, more than that, create. It is face to face with something which does not so far exist, to which it alone can give reality and substance, which it alone can bring into the light of day. And I begin to ask myself what it could have been, this unremembered state which brought with it no logical proof of its existence, but only the sense that it was that it was a real state in whose presence the other states of consciousness melted and vanished. So this seek, more than that, create, he's Proust, and it's complicated because Proust, the narrator, isn't precisely the same as Proust the author, because there's some distance, but he's suggesting it's not just looking back and trying to remember. It's this idea in the previous quotes about the narrativization. It's what people do. The human brain needs to tell stories. So you're not just seeking memories, more than that, you're creating them. It is face to face with something which does not so far exist, to which it alone, in other words, your ability to turn it into a narrative, can give reality and substance, which it alone can bring into the light of day. I decide to attempt to make it reappear. I retrace my thoughts to the moment at which I drank the first spoonful of tea. I find again the same state, illumined by no fresh light. I compel my mind to make one further effort, to follow and recapture once again the fleeting sensation, and that nothing may interrupt it in its course. I shut out every obstacle, every extraneous idea. I stop my ears and inhibit all attention to the sounds which come from the next room. And then, feeling that my mind has grown fatigued without having any success to report, I compel it for a change, to enjoy that distraction which I have just denied it, to think of other things, to rest and refresh itself before the supreme attempt. And then for the second time I clear an empty space in front of it. I place in position before my mind's eye the still recent taste of that first mouthful, and I feel something start within me, something that leaves its resting place and attempts to rise, something that has been embedded like an anchor at a great depth. I do not know yet what it is, but I can feel it mounting slowly. I can measure the resistance. I can hear the echo of great spaces traversed. And I'm not sure if it's just me and my dodgy eyes, but that's almost like looking out the back of a window. There aren't any droplets, but if you see a camera looking at a rainy scene and you see drops on the camera, it almost gives that illusion to my eyes at least. Undoubtedly, what is thus palpitating in the depths of my being must be the image, the visual memory which, being linked to that taste, has tried to follow it into my conscious mind. But its struggles are too far off, too much confused. Scarcely can I perceive the colourless reflection in which are blended the uncapturable whirling medley of radiant hues, and I cannot distinguish its form, cannot invite it, as the one possible interpreter, to translate to me the evidence of its contemporary, its inseparable paramour, the taste of cake soaked in tea. Cannot ask it to inform me what special circumstances in question, of what period in my past life. Will it ultimately reach the clear surface of my consciousness, this memory, this old dead moment, which the magnetism of an identical moment has travelled so far to importune, to disturb, to raise up out of the very depths of my being? I cannot tell. Now that I feel nothing, it has stopped, has perhaps gone down again into its darkness, from which who can say whether it will ever rise? 10 times over I must essay the task, must lean down over the abyss, and each time the natural laziness which deters us from every difficult enterprise, every work of importance, has urged me to leave the thing alone, to drink my tea, and to think merely of the worries of today, and of my hopes for tomorrow, which let themselves be pondered over without effort or distress of mind. And suddenly the memory returns. taste was of that little crumb of madeleine, which on Sunday mornings at Combray, because on those mornings I did not go out before church time, when I went to say good day to her in her bedroom, my aunt Leonie used to give me, dipping it first in her own cup of real or of lime flower tea. The sight of the little madeleine had recalled nothing to my mind before I tasted it. Perhaps because I had so often seen such things in the interval, without tasting them, on the trays in pastry cooks' windows, that their image had disassociated itself from those Combray days to take its place among others more recent. Perhaps because of those memories, so long abandoned and put out of mind, nothing now survived. Everything was scattered, the forms of things, including that of the little scallop shell of pastry, so richly sensual under its severe religious folds, were either obliterated or had been so long dormant as to have lost the power of expansion which would have allowed them to resume their place in my consciousness. But when from a long distant past nothing subsists, after the people are dead, after the things are broken and scattered, still, alone, more fragile, but with more vitality, more insubstantial, more persistent, more faithful, the smell and taste of things remain poised a long time, like souls ready to remind us, waiting and hoping for their moment amid the ruins of all the rest, and bear unfaltering in the tiny and almost impalpable drop of their essence the vast structure of recollection. I think that's just a stunning sentence, or the end of the sentence. And again, in a previous video, I've quoted William Blake, the notion of the line "to see infinity in a grain of sand" from his poem Auguries of Innocence. And that phrase there reminded me of it. And once I'd recognised the taste of the crumb of madeleine soaked in a decoction of lime flowers which my aunt used to give me, although I did not yet know and must long postpone the discovery of why this memory made me so happy. Immediately the old grey house upon the street, where her room was, rose up like the scenery of a theatre to attach itself to the little pavilion opening onto the garden which had been built out behind it for my parents, the isolated panel which until that moment had been all that I could see. And with the house, the town, from morning to night and in all weathers, the square where I was sent before luncheon, the streets along which I used to run errands, the country roads we took when it was fine. And just as the Japanese amuse themselves by filling a porcelain bowl with water and steeping in it little crumbs of paper, which until then are without character or form, but the moment they become wet, stretch themselves and bend, take on colour and distinctive shape, become flowers or houses or people, permanent and recognisable. So in that moment all the flowers in our garden and in Monsieur Swan's park, and the water lilies on the Vivant, and the good folk of the village, and the little dwellings, and the parish church, and the whole of Combray and of its surroundings, taking their proper shapes and growing solid, sprang into being, town and gardens alike, all from my cup of tea. I'll just end with this painting, which appropriately enough is called Place de la Madeleine. So I hope you enjoyed that. Till the next time, all the very best.